So picture a country where the population is physically shrinking.
Right.
Like the local schools are slowly emptying out, the core workforce is aging into retirement, and the birth rate has just absolutely collapsed. By every single law of traditional, macroeconomics 101, this country should be poor, stagnant, and slowly dying.
Yeah, the engine is basically running out of fuel,
Exactly. But instead, they are getting incredibly rich.
which is wild because it completely shatters the foundational assumption of modern capitalism. I mean, the idea that you need a constantly growing pool of humans to generate a growing pool of wealth.
Right. And if you're listening to this, you've probably heard politicians or economists panic about the demographic time bomb. So today on the Deep Dive, we have this massive stack of World Bank country series data, demographic indicators, telecommunications metrics, trade balances, the works.
A lot of data today.
So much data. And we are taking all of this to answer one massive counterintuitive question that is keeping policymakers awake at night, from like Tokyo to Rome to Seoul. And that is a shrinking, aging population really an economic terminal illness?
Because the assumption is that once your population growth goes negative, your economy is just destined to wither.
Right.
But the data we've pulled suggests something radically different, provided a country makes some very specific and, frankly, very painful structural pivots.
Yeah, and I want you to visualize a graph in your mind right now. We're looking at a country called St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Often abbreviated as VCT in the international data.
Exactly, VCT. So imagine a chart, a double-axis chart with two different lines. On the left side, we have the population growth rate. And for decades, it's a healthy, normal-looking red line, but then it starts to drop.
It plunges, actually.
It really does. It plunges until it breaks right through the zero axis, heading down into negative territory, hitting negative 1.056%. The population is officially shrinking.
A literal demographic contraction.
But then, look at the second line on this chart, the dark blue line. This is GDP per capita.
Yeah.
So the average economic output per person.
Right.
While the red population line is sinking like a stone, the blue GDP per capita line is skyrocketing, from just a few $100s to tens of thousands of dollars.
It's incredible to look at.
If we were looking at this on a screen, I would draw a massive red dashed circle right at the intersection where population growth drops below zero, with a huge bold arrow pointing to it saying, fewer people, but getting richer.
And that is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, we like macroeconomic rules to be visible and predictable, right?
Sure.
Young population equals growth. Aging population equals stagnation. It's comforting because it makes global forecasting easy. But when you step into the world of small island economics, that predictive machinery is completely broken.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I am looking at this World Bank data and my head is spinning. How does a tiny island nation break the ironclad rule of the demographic dividend? I mean, if you have fewer people, which means fewer hands to work and fewer consumers to buy local goods, how on earth do you get substantially richer?
Well, to answer that, you have to look at the mechanics behind the numbers. It's really a masterclass in adaptation, a mechanical shift from volume to value.
Okay.
But, and this is the caveat I want you to keep in the back of your mind for this entire deep dive, it is a prosperity wrapped in deep systemic vulnerabilities.
Right. It's not magic.
Exactly. It's not magic. There is a very heavy underlying cost to this transition.
So let's start by setting the stage physically, because the geography is really the catalyst for everything that follows. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a classic small island developing state.
SID, as economists call it.
SIDs, yeah. And when we say small, I need you to understand the severe physical constraints we're talking about here. The total landmass is exactly 390 square kilometers. That is it.
It's tiny.
For context, that is roughly the size of the city limits of Las Vegas, Nevada. But we aren't talking about a city inside a massive country. We are talking about an entire sovereign nation completely surrounded by the ocean.
And those physical boundaries are hard limits.
Yeah.
Like if you are a massive continental nation, say the United States or China, and you want to grow your economy, you can scale horizontally.
Right, just spread out.
Exactly. You can clear another 10,000 hectares to build sprawling manufacturing hubs or endless agricultural plantations or massive resource extraction mines.
But St. Vincent and the Grenadines cannot do that. The geographic constraints on traditional economic scaling are absolute.
Yeah, they really are.
So you have a sovereign nation operating out of the geographic equivalent of like a tiny garage. They have absolutely no room to put more desks. They cannot store massive physical inventory. They have no physical space to grow.
None.
And yet, if you look at the World Bank national accounts data, the GDP shows an absolute staircase of economic expansion over 3 decades.
Yeah, we drew gray guidelines on this chart just to show the magnitude leaps.
It's not a gentle upward slope. The GDP has leaped across magnitudes.
Because when you cannot scale horizontally by taking up more space, you are forced to scale vertically. You have to increase the density of value you produce per person.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the very first step in that vertical scaling, the absolute prerequisite for this economic miracle, was walking away from the one thing human societies have historically relied on for survival.
You're talking about the data point that honestly shocked me the most when we were prepping for this, the Great Agricultural Retreat.
Yeah, the dropping of the plow, basically.
Exactly. If we dig into the modeled International Labor Organization employment data, the trajectory is jarring. We see agricultural employment plummeting from nearly 25% of the national workforce down to just 9.3%.
A quarter of your entire working population was tied to the land, and over a few decades, that is slashed to less than a tenth. It's a massive structural transformation.
I mean, imagine a bar chart where the bar representing farming is just getting sheared off year after year, pushed down by a massive, bold downward arrow.
Right.
But I have to stop you here because I am genuinely stuck on this. I'm looking at an isolated island in the middle of the ocean. Isn't abandoning your ability to feed your own people incredibly dangerous?
Oh, absolutely.
Why on earth is a massive drop in agricultural employment being framed in this data as the spark for a GDP boom? Like, what happens if the supply chains freeze? Did they just decide to ignore the risk of starvation to make the GDP line go up?
Well, that is the natural instinctive reaction, and you are right to point out the severe food security risk, which we will definitely dissect later.
Good, because that stresses me out.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But you have to separate the concept of basic survival from the concept of macroeconomic growth. From a pure GDP per capita perspective, this agricultural retreat wasn't just good, it was the necessary release valve for the entire economy.
Explain the mechanism to me. Why does fewer farmers equal more wealth?
So we have to understand what agriculture actually looks like in a highly constrained island environment. We aren't talking about massive, hyper-efficient, automated mega farms in the American Midwest.
Right, where one guy on a GPS-guided tractor harvests 1,000 acres.
Exactly.
Okay.
Island agriculture historically, especially in the Caribbean, was highly labor-intensive, often focused on single cash crops like bananas, or just basic subsistence farming.
So a lot of physical effort for very little return.
Exactly. The economic value added per worker is incredibly low. You spend 10 hours sweating in the sun, and the global market value of the crop you produce that day is practically nothing.
Because you're competing with massive continental exporters who have crazy economies of scale.
Precisely. So by shrinking the agricultural sector, the country was essentially shedding a low productivity, low value added industry.
Okay, I understand the math of low productivity, but I still don't see how firing farmers makes the country rich. You just have a bunch of unemployed farmers now.
Not unemployed. Released.
Released.
Yeah. This introduces a foundational concept in developmental economics known as the Lewis turning point.
Okay.
It's named after the Nobel laureate Arthur Lewis, who incidentally was from the Caribbean himself. The theory goes that developing economies have a massive pool of surplus labor tied up in traditional low-yield sectors like subsistence farming.
Right.
Because there are so many people farming such little land, their marginal productivity is close to zero. If you pull a worker off that farm, the total harvest doesn't really drop much.
So they are practically redundant labor.
Exactly. The Lewis turning point occurs when that surplus labor is finally drawn out of the fields and absorbed into a modern, higher productivity sector.
Ah, I see.
Suddenly, a worker who was generating maybe $10 of value a day on a banana plantation is retrained and starts generating $200 of value a day in a new industry. The overall wealth of the nation surges.
Wow.
So if 15% of VCT's entire national workforce is suddenly no longer tied to low-yield farming, that is a massive reservoir of human bandwidth freed up.
But wait, in the traditional Arthur Lewis model, that surplus farm labor usually moves into massive, smoky manufacturing plants in the cities, right?
Usually, yes.
That's what happened in the Industrial Revolution in the UK, or more recently in China. They left the farms to build iPhones and cars. But we already established that St. Vincent is 390 square kilometers. They can't build Shenzhen in the Caribbean.
Right.
So where did this 15% of the workforce physically go?
They bypassed the Industrial Revolution entirely They skipped the smoky factories and went straight to the great replacement, which is the engine of services.
Okay. When we look at the economic landscape modeled as a stacked area chart, the picture becomes incredibly clear. Imagine three colored blocks stacked on top of each other representing the total economy.
Right.
At the bottom, you have agriculture, and that block is shrinking. In the middle, you have industry and manufacturing, which stays relatively flat and small because of those physical constraints we talked about.
Exactly.
But on top, you have this massive dark blue block representing the services sector. And this block just continually expands, squeezing out everything else until it hits a massive structural inflection point. In the data, we marked it with a vertical dashed line.
Hitting over 66.4% of the country's entire GDP.
Two-thirds of the economy.
Yeah. This is how the tiny garage generates Fortune 500 revenues. The mechanics of a service-driven economy are fundamentally unbound by physical borders.
If you are listening to this on your commute, you might be thinking what I was thinking. SIDs are famous for tourism. Is this service economy just a bunch of fancy resorts? Are these former farmers just serving pina coladas to tourists now?
Well, tourism is absolutely a massive pillar of it, but services is a much broader category. It includes international financial services, offshore banking, maritime registry, real estate, and digital outsourcing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. A service worker, say, someone managing international financial compliance or marketing high-end ecotourism globally generates exponentially higher GDP per capita than a worker harvesting crops on a steep hillside. The value of an intangible service can scale infinitely higher than the value of a physical crop.
Because the service isn't bound by the soil, I can only grow so many bananas on an acre of land. But I can process an infinite number of financial transactions from a single laptop on a desk.
Exactly. By shifting the bulk of their workforce into this service block, St. Vincent dramatically raised the average economic output of every single citizen. That is the core mechanism that drives the GDP per capita lineup, even as the total population goes down.
But hold on. I'm going to put you back again.
Go for it.
To run a modern service economy that makes up 66% of your GDP, particularly in finance or global tourism, you cannot just be serving each other. You are selling these services to the rest of the world. And you are doing it from an island in the Caribbean Sea. How did they physically connect to the buyers of these new services? You can't just yell financial advice across the ocean. There has to be a physical bridge, right?
There is, but it's an invisible bridge. And this is the piece of the puzzle that often gets overlooked in macroeconomic summaries: the digital infrastructure.
The telecom data we pulled for this deep dive is absolutely staggering. We are talking about an explosion here. The metrics show fixed broadband subscriptions rocketing from practically a single connection to over 30,000.
It's a massive spike.
And the mobile cellular data is even crazier. Subscriptions went from absolute zero in the early years of the data to well over 100 per 100 people. We put a little magnifying glass icon on the steepest part of this curve because it's just so wild.
Meaning there are more active mobile connections than there are human beings on the island.
Yes. But how does a developing island nation afford that? How do they get fiber optic cables out to the middle of the ocean? Who paid for that?
It requires massive capital investment, often a combination of government debt, which we will definitely discuss, and partnerships with multinational telecommunications consortiums.
Okay.
Laying submarine fiber optic cables is incredibly expensive, but it is the absolute prerequisite for the economic miracle we are discussing. This rapid closure of the digital divide was the invisible infrastructure that made that 66% service sector possible.
Without the internet, the released agricultural workers have absolutely nothing to pivot to. They would just be unemployed.
Exactly. You cannot be a digital nomad hub or an offshore financial center without flawless, high-speed connectivity. Digitalization allowed VCT to export services globally, entirely unconstrained by their geography.
Right.
They didn't need to dredge massive deepwater ports for cargo ships to export physical goods. They just needed enough bandwidth to export data. The telecommunications boom was the catalyst that activated the latent potential of the workforce that had left the agricultural sector.
Okay, so the mechanics are making sense now. You build the invisible bridge of the internet. People leave the low-yield farms. They get connected. They start generating high-value intangible services, and the wealth of the nation goes up.
That's the formula.
But here is where it gets really interesting and where we have to address the elephant in the room, the people themselves, the demographic reversal.
Right, the plunging line from our very first visualization.
Let's trace that population growth rate again. In the historical data, it starts at a very healthy, robust 1.7% growth, a growing, expanding society.
Typical for a developing nation.
But over the decades, it slides down, crosses the zero line, which we marked with a thick black line in our charts, and enters the ominous dark red territory of negative 0.56%. The country is physically shrinking in human capital. So I have to ask, why did they stop having kids? Was it a conscious policy or just a side effect of getting richer?
It's rarely a conscious government policy in these contexts. It's an aggressive sociological shift. When you dig into the underlying demographic indicators, you see a confluence of two massive trends.
Okay.
The first is a precipitous drop in the fertility rate. The historical data shows fertility rates of over 7 births per woman.
Think about that for a second. 7 children per family was the cultural norm.
It was the norm because in an agrarian society, children are an economic asset. They are free farm labor.
Right.
They help harvest the crops. They tend the animals. They're your retirement plan when you get too old to work the fields. But as the economy modernized, as people moved from the farms to the towns to work in the service sector, the economic calculus of having children completely flipped.
How so?
In a service economy, a child is no longer an economic asset. They are a massive economic liability.
Ouch. True, but ouch.
I know it sounds harsh, but mathematically, you cannot put a 6-year-old to work in an offshore banking compliance office. Instead, you have to pay for their housing, their clothing, and most importantly, their education for the next 18 to 20 years before they can enter the workforce.
Right. The cost of raising a child skyrockets.
Combine that economic reality with the urbanization that naturally follows a shift to services, where housing space is tighter and more expensive, and the fertility rate absolutely plummets. In VCT, it dropped from over 7 down to roughly 1.7.
Which is well below the replacement level of 2.1. So the population is naturally not replacing itself through births.
Correct. And when you combine that sub-replacement fertility rate with consistent out-migration, young people leaving the island to seek university education or specialized opportunities in the US, the UK, or Canada, you get a total population in absolute undeniable decline.
And it isn't just that there are fewer people. It is the composition of the people that remain that changes the entire macroeconomic reality. This introduces a concept that I find deeply unsettling, visually.
The scissors gap.
The scissors gap of aging. I want you to picture 2 lines on a graph. One line represents the population under the age of 15, the youth, the future workforce. That line is plunging downwards.
Right.
The other line represents the population over the age of 65, the retirees. That line is steadily, relentlessly climbing upwards. Right in the middle of the chart, those 2 lines cross like an open pair of scissors. We even put a bright circle right at that intersection point.
And that intersection point, that scissors gap, is the single most critical pressure point for the entire social and economic system of a nation. It is a terrifying visual for any finance minister.
Let's break down why it's terrifying. I'm assuming it has to do with who is paying the bills.
Exactly. It's about the dependency ratio. The working age population, the people between 18 and 64 who are actually powering that 66% service sector, paying the income taxes and driving consumption, is being squeezed from both sides.
Man, that's tough.
Imagine being a 35-year-old worker in this economy. You have to support your own child, which is incredibly expensive now. But you also have to generate enough tax revenue to support 2 or 3 aging parents or grandparents who require pensions and increasingly expensive geriatric health care.
And you have to do all of this while recognizing that the cohort of youth coming up behind you is shrinking, meaning the burden will only get heavier.
Exactly. The dependency ratio completely flips. You have fewer people putting money into the national pot and more people taking money out of the national pot for healthcare and pensions. This is the exact mathematical nightmare that is causing panic in places like Italy, Japan, and South Korea right now.
Which brings us right back to the central paradox of this entire deep dive.
Right.
Because I'm looking at this scissors gap, I'm looking at the negative population growth, and I have to ask, if the workforce is physically shrinking because of negative growth and the burden is multiplying because of the aging retirees, how on earth is the GDP per capita still going up?
It seems impossible.
It does. How do you lose workers, gain retirees, and still get richer as a nation?
Because of what they did with the youth they did have. This is the pivot from quantity to quality. If you have fewer people, if your labor pool is shrinking, every single individual person has to be exponentially more productive, more resilient, and more highly skilled. You simply cannot afford a single wasted mind.
So it's an aggressive investment in human capital. We divided this into two distinct areas in the data, the health dividend and the education dividend. Let's look at the health data first because it's a profound human success story.
It really is.
The historic mortality data shows infant and under 5 mortality rates that used to be in the 70s per 1,000 live births. That means historically, 7 out of every 100 children born on the island didn't make it to their 5th birthday.
A tragedy that was all too common.
But the data shows those numbers plummeting down to near 10 per 1,000 live births. It is a massive, historic drop. We drew a span line on the chart to show the cumulative drop, and it's just staggering.
And you have to understand the mechanics of why that drop happened and how it connects to the economic pivot. Bringing the infant mortality rate down from the 70s to near 10 doesn't just happen because you wish for it.
Right.
It requires systemic public health infrastructure. It means building modern clinics, ensuring clean water access, funding widespread vaccination campaigns, and providing maternal education.
All of which costs money.
Exactly. But it creates a feedback loop. When parents know with near certainty that their children will survive to adulthood, the psychological pressure to have 7 children, just in case 2 don't make it, completely vanishes.
Oh, that makes total sense.
They have fewer children, say 1 or 2, but they invest massively more personal resources into them. The state does the exact same thing. With far fewer children entering the healthcare and school systems, the per capita spend on child development skyrockets.
Yeah.
You get fewer workers, but they are dramatically healthier.
Yeah.
Better cognitive development from birth.
Which perfectly tees up the education dividend. The data points to incredible educational parity and retention. We see extremely high continuation rates to grade 5 and massive surges in secondary school enrollment.
Huge surges.
But when I was looking through the demographics of this education data, there was a huge asterisk, a detail that completely changes the narrative of how this workforce became so hyperproductive. We put literal stars on the chart for this.
The gender dynamic.
Yes, the aggressive rise of female human capital. When you look at the enrollment and retention rates, particularly in secondary education and beyond, the female indicators frequently outpace the male indicators. Women are not just participating in this new service economy, they are dominating the human capital development metrics.
And this right here is the secret sauce. This is how you beat the demographic curse. Historically, in a heavily agrarian economy, female labor might be restricted, undervalued, or sidelined entirely from the formal macroeconomic data.
Right, because of the physical nature of the work.
Exactly. But when you transition to a digital, service-based economy, physical strength is irrelevant. Cognitive ability, education, and connectivity are all that matter.
So by ensuring high-level education for women, they essentially unlocked a massive vault of previously underutilized economic potential.
Precisely. You trade absolute quantity of citizens for absolute quality. Fewer children are born, yes, but nearly all of them survive. They are highly educated, far beyond the primary level. And crucially, half of your population women are now fully educated and fully integrated into the high-value, digitally connected workforce.
That's huge.
An educated woman working in global tourism management or digital services generates exponentially more economic value than what was ever possible in the previous paradigm. The human capital index of the nation rises so significantly that it completely overpowers the negative drag of the shrinking population. You essentially double your effective intellectual workforce, even as the total headcount shrinks.
Okay, I have to admit, when you lay it out like that, it sounds like a utopian pivot. We realized farming wasn't scaling, so we built the internet, we educated everyone equally, we focused on health, and everyone got rich. The charts go up and to the right.
But you know it's never that clean.
No, it never is, because we haven't talked about the cost of this utopian pivot. You mentioned earlier that building hospitals, laying submarine fiber optic cables, and funding universal secondary education costs a massive amount of capital.
A staggering amount.
Capital that a tiny island of 390 square kilometers historically did not have. Which leads us to the turn in our deep dive, the dark side of prosperity. Because when we look at the macroeconomic vulnerabilities, the structural weaknesses of this model really bear their teeth.
You cannot run a high-wire act without a lot of wind threatening to blow you off. And the primary wind in this scenario is debt.
Let's talk about the debt trap. The tone of the data shifts violently here. We are looking at the external debt stock, abbreviated in the World Bank data as the DoD. And the chart is absolutely climbing. It looks like a mountain.
We need to unpack what the DoD actually is, because it's distinct from household debt. DOD stands for Debt Outstanding and Disbursed.
Okay.
In this context, we are primarily looking at external sovereign debt. This is money the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines has borrowed from foreign entities, other countries, international monetary funds, or private foreign banks to fund its operations and its massive structural transition.
And what is genuinely scary are the vertical spikes in the data showing the debt servicing. We highlighted these peaks with vertical text boxes. This is the percentage of the gross national income that is swallowed up just paying the interest and the principal on what they owe. There are years where huge, terrifying chunks of the entire nation's income are just vaporized to pay creditors. It's like a liquidity vacuum.
Because a service economy transitioning rapidly from agriculture requires front-loaded capital. You have to build the airport to bring the tourists. You have to build the digital infrastructure to enable the offshore banking. You have to fund the schools to train the workers. A small island does not have sufficient domestic savings or a large enough tax base to fund that transition up front. So they borrow externally.
I was trying to figure out a way to visualize the danger of this. The best analogy I can come up with is a person living an incredibly luxurious lifestyle. Let's say you have a friend who is wearing designer clothes, eating at five-star restaurants every night, and running a very successful consulting business from their laptop.
Sounds nice.
They look rich, right? Their GDP per capita is high. But if you look at their actual finances, the entire lifestyle, the laptop, the clothes, the car is funded by maxed out credit cards. And their ability to pay the minimum balance on those cards relies entirely on unpredictable freelance gigs. If the gigs dry up for even 1 month, the whole illusion collapses.
That is a brutally accurate analogy. And in the macroeconomic data, those unpredictable freelance gigs are represented by foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Explain FDI in this context. How is it different from the government borrowing money?
Foreign direct investment is when a foreign entity physically invests in the country. It's not a loan to the government. It's, say, a Canadian development company deciding to build a massive new luxury resort on the island.
Right.
Or a British telecom company building a new data center.
Got it.
It brings a massive sudden influx of foreign cash, creates local construction jobs, and eventually creates service jobs.
Which sounds great. We want that, right?
We do, but look at the volatility in the data. If we examine the FDI net inflows as a percentage of GDP on this band chart we made, it is a violent roller coaster. In some periods, it drops to near 0%. It's flat. In others, it spikes up to an astonishing 26% of the entire national GDP. We circle the highest high and the lowest low just to show the absolute drop.
Wait, 26%? Imagine a quarter of the entire United States economy just vanishing or reappearing based on the whims of foreign investors year by year. That is terrifying. Why is it so volatile?
Let's use your analogy again. Imagine the island is a high-end restaurant and the foreign capital is an erratic billionaire patron. When the global economy is booming, when interest rates are low and investors are feeling bold, the billionaire comes into the restaurant, rents out the entire place, tips extravagantly, and pays for an expansion of the kitchen. That's the FDI spiking to 26%.
Everyone is happy.
Right. The resorts are being built, the construction workers are flush with cash, tax revenues are high, and the government can easily service its external debt.
But what happens when a global recession hits? What happens during a 2008 financial crisis or a global pandemic?
The billionaire stops coming to the restaurant. The capital flight is immediate. Foreign developers pull their money out of risky island projects halfway through construction. The FDI plummets to near zero. Tourism dries up instantly because people in the US and UK stop traveling. The service exports crash.
But, and here is the jaws of the debt trap, the external debt stock doesn't shrink. The credit card bill is still due. The government still owes millions in interest payments for the airport and the telecom cables they already built.
Exactly. So suddenly, a massive percentage of whatever national income you do have left is siphoned straight out of the country just to service the debt. The government has to enact brutal austerity, cutting local spending on schools or health, just to avoid defaulting on foreign loans. The liquidity pump reverses, and it violently drains the island.
So you have built a Ferrari of a service economy, but you don't own the gas station, and you bought the car on credit. You are entirely at the mercy of global macroeconomic weather.
And quite literally actual weather. Which brings us to the next massive layer of vulnerability, the physical environment.
Right, because you cannot analyze an island economy without looking at the physical rock it sits on. The World Bank data gives us a chilling metric regarding environmental red lines. 7.8% of the total land area of St. Vincent and the Grenadines sits below 5 meters of elevation.
That's a huge proportion of usable land.
It is,
Yeah.
and a massive portion of the urban population, the commercial centers, and the tourist infrastructure lives and operates in that exact low-lying zone. We put a horizontal red line on our dashboard graphic to show the safety threshold.
Simultaneously, the global data shows an upward trend in CO2 emissions, which directly translates to sea level rise and an increased frequency of extreme weather events, particularly Caribbean hurricanes.
So you have a highly educated, highly productive service sector living and working on the coast, facing an existential climate threat that could wipe out the resorts and the telecom infrastructure in a single afternoon.
It's a constant looming threat.
But it's not just the water coming in from the storms that makes them vulnerable. It is what has to come in on ships every single day.
The structural trade imbalance.
Yes. If you're listening, you might have caught this loose thread earlier. When we were cheering for the Great Agricultural Retreat, when we said it was a brilliant move to drop farming from 24% of the workforce down to 9% to free up labor for the service economy, what are they eating? If nobody is farming, where does the food come from?
The data is unambiguous. VCT has to import its food. It has to import its machinery, its fuel to run the power plants, its vehicles, its consumer goods. Almost everything physical required to sustain a modern, high-standard living society has to be put on a cargo ship and brought in from outside.
This creates what economists visualize as a massive trade treadmill. We built a waterfall chart for this. Imagine a deep, heavy deficit, a constant bleeding out of cash to pay for imported physical goods. Millions of dollars leaving the island every month just to buy basic calories, gasoline, and building materials.
But then, powering that treadmill, keeping the country from going bankrupt, is the massive surplus generated from service exports. The tourism dollars coming in, the financial service fees coming in.
It is the ultimate high-wire balancing act. The island has essentially made a grand bargain with globalization. They said, we will stop growing our own food and making our own goods. We are too small to be efficient at it. Instead, we will focus entirely on providing high-end, intangible services to foreigners. And we will use the money we make from those services to buy our food and goods from the global market.
It is the purest expression of comparative advantage in international trade. But it requires the entire global system to work flawlessly. If the global supply chains freeze, say, during a geopolitical crisis or a pandemic, the price of importing food and fuel skyrockets.
Yeah, we've all seen how that goes.
And if simultaneously global tourism drops, the service export crash. The revenue stream disappears, but the need to import food and fuel never goes away. People still have to eat. The power grid still needs diesel.
And when the service revenue can't cover the import bill for food and fuel, what happens?
They have no choice. They borrow more money.
The credit card again.
Exactly. The external debt climbs even higher. The DoD spikes again. It is a terrifying, reinforcing cycle of vulnerability. Every time there's an external shock, whether it's a hurricane destroying a hotel or a global recession stopping tourists from traveling, the country has to take on more debt just to survive the gap, which makes them even more vulnerable to the next shock.
This is incredibly intense. I feel like we have all these disparate, heavy pieces of a massive macroeconomic puzzle floating in the air. We've got demographics, farming, digital cables, female education, sovereign debt, and climate change. Let's pull them all together for the listener right now. Let's build a mental map that ties every single data point we have discussed into one grand system dynamics loop.
Let's trace the logic from the very beginning, the causal chain.
Okay, follow along with me. Step 1, it starts with the demographic reality. Negative population growth and a rapidly aging society. A plunging birth rate means fewer workers, and a rising life expectancy means more retirees. The scissors gap.
Step 2, that severe demographic pressure forces a societal pivot. Because you cannot rely on cheap, abundant labor anymore, the state and families are forced into extreme human capital investment. They pour resources into the health and education of the few children they do have, leading to a highly skilled, gender-equitable workforce.
Step 3, that highly skilled, highly educated workforce enables the structural transition. They abandon low-yield agriculture because it's a waste of their education, and they leverage the newly built digital infrastructure to transition aggressively into a modern, globalized service economy.
Step 4, that transition to a digital and tourism service economy is highly lucrative, which causes the GDP per capita to climb dramatically. Wealth is generated. The economic miracle appears on the charts. Fewer people, much more money.
Step 5. But, and here's the trap that closes the loop, maintaining that hyper-efficient service economy and importing the food you no longer grow relies on a massive structural trade deficit, extreme volatility in foreign direct investment, and high, potentially crippling levels of external sovereign debt. Plus, the entire physical apparatus sits on coastal land incredibly vulnerable to a changing climate.
It is a closed, self-reinforcing loop. The demographics force the human capital investment, which builds the service economy, which creates the wealth, but the wealth is fundamentally fragile and heavily debt-dependent.
I want to ask you, the listener, directly, what stands out to why you in this causal loop we just built? When you look at the story of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, what is your gut reaction? Are you seeing a brilliant, adaptive blueprint for success in the 21st century, a masterclass in how a nation can pivot and survive population decline? Or are you seeing a terrifying house of cards funded by debt and foreign whims, just waiting for the next global recession or Category 5 hurricane to blow it all down?
The honest answer from an economist's perspective is that it is likely both simultaneously. It is a brilliant adaptation that carries an immense, unavoidable risk. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for small island developing states, and perhaps for the rest of the world, navigating this reality. To survive demographic decline and physical constraints, we can identify three non-negotiable pillars of resilience.
Lay them out for us. What are the three pillars? We visualize these as three massive text blocks on our final slide.
Pillar 1, quality must replace quantity. When your population is shrinking, investing in human capital is your only defense against irrelevance. You need near-zero infant mortality, you need near-universal secondary and tertiary education, and absolutely crucially, you need complete economic integration of women.
Pillar 2.
Pillar 2, services must replace agriculture. You have to undergo the structural shift. You cannot get rich farming small plots of land in a globalized world. You must move your educated labor pool from low-yield physical work to high-yield intangible exports, powered by robust digital infrastructure.
And the third pillar, which sounds like the hardest one to actually pull off.
It is the hardest. Pillar 3, building economic resilience to counter extreme macro and climate vulnerabilities. You have generated wealth from your services, yes. But you must use that wealth to aggressively manage your external debt. You must build sovereign wealth funds as buffers to survive the inevitable crashes in FDI. And you must invest heavily in climate adaptation, building seawalls and resilient infrastructure for that 7.8% of your land that sits below 5 meters. Because without this third pillar, the success of the first two pillars will eventually be wiped out by external shocks.
Quality over quantity, services over agriculture, resilience over vulnerability. It is a massive generational undertaking for a country of any size, let alone a small island facing down the ocean. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over today. We have spent the last hour dissecting the survival strategy of a tiny, resource-strapped island in the Caribbean. We watched them completely rewrite the rules of Macroeconomics 101, figuring out how to get significantly richer while their population physically shrank.
By leaning entirely into human capital and services.
Right, but take a step back and think about the global news right now.
Right.
What does this island model mean for massive developed economies? Look at Japan, look at Italy, look at South Korea. Their governments are currently in absolute panic mode about their own shrinking, aging populations. They are experiencing the exact same scissors gap we discussed today, just on a scale of millions of people instead of thousands.
They are terrified of that plunging red line on the population chart. They view it as an economic terminal illness.
Exactly. So here's the question. Are those massive economic titans looking in the wrong places for answers? Are we looking at the future survival blueprint of the developed world, not in the halls of massive continental industrial powers, but pioneered by a small island nation in the Caribbean? Will the macro economies of tomorrow with shrinking labor pools and aging citizens have to look a lot more like St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
It is a fascinating proposition to consider, because the demographic math is coming for everyone eventually. The only variable left is how you choose to adapt.
It brings us right back to the beginning. The diagnostic X-ray of the global economy might look murky and terrifying. But if you look closely enough at the anomalies, the outliers, the small islands defying the odds, you might just see the cure. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the data today. Keep questioning the charts, keep looking for the human stories hiding behind the numbers, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.